Snow began falling as a massive seagoing vessel approached the Russian port of Murmansk. It was the largest transportation barge then sailing the seas. Slung underneath it were the remains of the Kursk submarine. It was the culmination of one of the most audacious salvages of all time, and finally, 118 submariners who perished would be brought back home. The sunken, nuclear-powered submarine Kursk lay for a year at the bottom of the icy Arctic Sea before a daring team of Dutch engineers raised the wreck and delivered it back to the Russian Navy. Aboard were the bodies of 118 Russian submariners. President Vladimir Putin had vowed to bring them home, but also to find out why the pride of the Russian fleet exploded and sank.
The loss of a submarine in peacetime is a huge tragedy.
Igor Spassky designed the Kursk submarine. He was the head of the top-secret submarine design bureau, Rubin, and it was his name on the line when he hired two Dutch brothers with no salvage experience to do the perilous job.
The role of Franz and Jan in this business was immense.
Spassky later told me, I went to Putin and I said to Putin, when we really wanted to do this job, we must do it with the brothers van Submarine, because they can do it.
The younger brother, Jan van Submarine, masterminded the engineering and joked with Spassky.
He says, you'll get a statue in Leningrad, but if you don't manage to get it out of there. I tell him, well, write it down on a couple of advisory reports, not on the original contract, and then we'll have settled things the right way.
Before the van Submarine brothers could make their bid for the lucrative contract, salvage giant Smit made an offer that President Vladimir Putin could not refuse. Kees van Essen was commercial director at the time.
Putin made one promise. I will take the bodies back home before Christmas. So that was the moment to attack.
When I came the first time in Russia by Spassky, Spassky told me, sorry Franz, you are too late, because we want to give the job to this consortium.
This is Rotterdam, the world's largest port city. It is home to Mammoet Heavy Lift Company, at the time owned by the van Submarine brothers, and to their competitor Smit Salvage, a Dutch ship salvage company. Smit was a step ahead in winning the bid.
10 years before, the Komsomolets went down. That was also a nuclear-powered submarine from the Russian Navy. And our plan was approved, but unfortunately, when that was approved, the Russian Federation collapses. We had a different setup and there was no more budget.
The Kursk presented special problems for a salvage operation, and Smit had solutions.
The major issue was that the Russians want to have the torpedo room to be cut off. That's where all the trouble started. There was an explosion and it was a big mess down there. It was a nuclear-powered submarine, so they wanted to avoid all possibilities for any vibration in the submarine, because that could have started up the nuclear power plant again without cooling water, and then seriously it could have ended as another Chernobyl.
Smit had just developed a unique new system for sawing through steel. Their expertise opened the doors of St. Petersburg's corridors of power.
We had our contacts, of course, with the engineering company, Rubin, in St. Petersburg, and also the head engineer down there was Mr. Spassky. He was also still there, so we had our contacts. And because of our planning for the Komsomolets in the past with Herema, we approached them as well and see if we could make a new combination.
Jan van Submarine, however, had already devised a crucial, unique, heave compensation system to handle the Arctic Ocean waves.
I got it quickly with those nitrogen cylinders and those reels. I knew how I wanted to do that. And then I went to the pub. It was during the weekend too, and there I was explaining. We often go to the pub together with our staff, and there we were, cozily chatting together. And then we said, well, if we did it that way. And there, I made that sketch.
We had in our operation, our planned operation, 25 work packages, which were all priced as a budget indication. They considered the budget indications as a lump sum, and we could not do this operation on a lump sum basis.
Spassky and I, we had direct a good feeling. And also our engineers and their engineers, directly the click was there.
Irma pulled out, leaving us alone with no lifting equipment. We could cut the forward part, we have our divers, we can make the openings, we could construct these grippers, but we had no lifting device.
When the Smith-led consortium fell through, Igor Spassky called Frans van Zuimeren.
I said to Spassky, I will come back in 1 week and then I will tell you if we can do the job or we cannot do the job in 2001. It was also the most difficult decision we had to make. We went through the whole program, we talked to the subcontractors, and then we said, we go for it.
Frans and Jan van Zuimeren were complete outsiders, but found an ally in St. Petersburg.
You must understand that this operation was not just financial, even though the company did make a profit.
I never agreed on the price so fast in my life. I thought, less than 50 million, I don't do the job. We sit down and Spassky said to me, Frans, I got $65 million I got from the Russian government, and I can offer you 62.5 million. I said, okay, then, merci. And that was the deal.
That was incredible. You've got the system in your head, and then you need to actually execute it. You know it can work this way. But how do you get that plug into that hole? Yeah? And how do I make that hole in there? And what's forming an obstruction underneath that hole? So you've got a lot of problems you need to solve. But all those solutions needed to be invented in just a few months, yeah? And that meant that we needed to rush.
The total lump sum was in Utrecht on the bank, and 60 milestones, and every time when we did a part of the work, we made an act undersigned by Bashkov, by Spassky and myself. With this act I went to the bank, and so they paid us.
Vitaly Fedko is a Russian filmmaker who recorded the salvage of the Kursk submarine from the Russian ships. He came to know Igor Spassky and the Russian naval officers well.
The Kursk was the project 949A, or Ante. It was a very powerful submarine to be used to attack American aircraft carriers.
The Kursk submarine was the pride of the Russian fleet, the largest attack submarine ever built, designed to stay underwater for months. It was built of special steel with a rubber coating, making it stealthy and fast. It was armed with cruise missiles, a terrifying threat to the navies of NATO. It was based in the Arctic port of Murmansk. On August 12, 2000, the Kursk successfully launched a dummy torpedo during a massive Russian naval exercise in the Barents Sea. Its captain told fleet headquarters that he would launch one more when 2 large explosions were recorded. The second was estimated to be the equivalent of 2 tons of TNT. Vladimir Putin refused international offers of help and eventually had to admit the entire crew had perished. Angry members of the Submariners' families challenged the Russian government, which tried swiftly to quiet criticism. It was a political catastrophe. On May 23, 2001, Franz von Submarine signed a contract with the Russian Navy to raise the Kursk submarine from the Barents Sea before the beginning of the next Arctic winter. The deal could make or break the Dutch brothers, and they knew they could not deliver without some help. But before the salvage team could deploy to the frigid Barents Sea, there was still much to design and build. The Russians awarded the contract for raising the nuclear-powered submarine Kursk from the bottom of the Barents Sea to the Dutch heavy lift company Mammoet.
Mammoet already had approached the Russian Navy as well with their solutions in the meantime we were negotiating, and they performed very well on a stadium, lifting a roof of a stadium with their lifting devices. So when we had to quit for the time being, then they jumped on the bandwagon and they were contracted on a lump sum basis. And then we offered our services, what we already had prepared, to Mammoet. And that's the reason why we did it together.
The project was complex, with the hostile Arctic environment, torpedoes and nuclear reactors on board, increasing the risks.
There were 2 nuclear reactors on board, and they were cut off. And Spassky said they are cut off, there's no nuclear danger. He said to Spassky, we want to hire English Navy experts on nuclear to check if everything is in order. At the end, he said, okay, I accept it.
The plan involved lifting the submarine from the bottom of the sea using over 24 strand jacks. These are hydraulic pulleys that work slowly so as to avoid sudden tension in the lifting cable. There would need to be a system to compensate for the massive heave of the waves to keep the submarine stable. Heavy lift is Mammoet's speciality. Strand jacks are its staple. But a project on this scale had never been tried before. Smith would use a revolutionary abrasive cutting system to remove the submarine's torpedo compartment. That was a fundamental condition in the contract. Theo Haak was the Smith R&D engineer who developed the cutting wire in record time, but it was still untested.
The cutting wire is a very simple system. You bring a force onto a wire and back and forth, but you must find the right particles for the bushings. And during the testing we find out that wolfram carbide was the most effective for cutting the ship's structure.
2 large vacuum anchors used negative pressure to dig themselves deeper into the sea floor as a hydraulic pulley activated the cutting wires, keeping them at 20 degrees to the steel in maximum abrasion. Cutting from the top downwards kept the Kursk fixed to the sea floor, avoiding dangerous vibrations. The key to cutting through the tough steel casing was a chain covered in highly abrasive cylinders, known as bushings.
Dit is het drive system. Here you have the cylinder and here you have the drive wire. The cylinder has a speed of 0.25 meters per second, and that you can multiply because you have 4 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you have 1 meter per second speed here.
The Mammoth team focused on actually raising the submarine using strandjacks, the incredibly powerful hydraulic pulleys that use tiny motions to pull up cables. But those cables would have to be housed somewhere. Mammoth engineers began designing giant spools for the cables to be wound onto. Then Mammoth chose the largest lifting barge on the seas of the time, the Smith-owned Giant 4 barge. It would host the strandjack towers, cable spools, and the salvage workers getting the massive machines ready for the historic undersea job.
We had scheduled to use our giant barge as an upside-down cradle where we would lift the vessel through the barge and then fix it to the cradle and bring it under the giant barge into Murmansk.
Russian engineers had provided the Dutch team with the precise layout of the Kursk submarine and indicated where holes could be cut to insert the grippers. This plan had to be accurately reproduced on the Giant 4's deck, indicating where to make holes in the hull to pass the cables through. The lifting towers and heave compensation system were placed directly above them, while a space was made under the barge for the submarine's conning tower. A saddle was built to hold her in place. Mammoth engineers now had to design the giant grippers to actually insert into the submarine's hull for lifting. The grippers would open only once inside the hull. Russian engineers came to check on progress. The grippers would have to be guided into the submarine by tubes specially designed to fit a specific hole in the vessel's hull. The Dutch side of the operation was underway, but salvage masters now had to devise how the Kursk would be towed into the dry dock of Murmansk. The combined draft of the barge and submarine together was too deep to enter the shallower dry dock. Russian and Dutch engineers decided to build 2 special pontoons that would raise the Giant 4 by 16 meters, with the Kursk slung underneath it. In June 2001, the ATM pontoon carrying the Smith cutting system sailed to Kirkenes in Norway for testing. It was the moment of truth.
All the components are sent to Kirkenes, and there we assembled all the system. And there also the actual testing take place. And during that testing a lot of problems occur. We have problems with the hydraulics, we have problems with the computers, and also with the saw bushing itself.
The steel abrasive bushings were proving inefficient, so Theo Haag ordered them sent back to Rotterdam by truck.
All the bushings was sent back by truck to Holland, and within a week it was back, and testing started again.
In the meantime, Frans van Soimeren hired the Norwegian diving ship Mayo to host the divers, who were crucial to the success of the operation.
You can rent a diving ship, let's say, per day. I tried to get them into a kind of a lump sum, but they didn't want to do that. But at the end, they did a perfect job, and it was a good decision.
While the Giant 4 was being completed, divers were already on the wreck, cutting holes with millimetric precision in the locations indicated by the Russian technicians. Each diver wore a heated dive suit, and was supplied with camera and microphone to communicate with operators above the surface. Aboard the Mayo, technicians gave instructions to the divers as to where to cut. Chris Boss was one of only 4 Smit divers on the project.
I was there for my expertise in underwater cutting, because we had to install 26 of those grippers on the inner hull. That means that we had to open up the outer hull and clear all the, well, whatever is there out of the way, so that we could cut a hole for the grippers.
The eerie sight of the Kursk's conning tower was a somber reminder to divers of the tragedy that had befallen the 118 submariners. They worked in freezing water and were kept at sub-sea pressure while off-duty too. As the days went by, the operation continued to get more risky. It was dark and cold at 100 meters under the Arctic Sea, where divers began cutting holes in the steel hull of the Kursk submarine for the grippers that would lift her. It would take a total of 26 grueling days, working in shifts of 3.
You are under the pressure all the time. You live in a pressurized system on board, and the transport from the vessel to the job site is via a bell, a diving bell. Those bells on the Mayo, we had 2 bell system, so the 3 persons in 1 bell, 2 divers and 1 standby diver. You just get tapped on the shoulder like you do on a normal job. From time for you to go, the next one will take over, so you don't lose any time.
Divers used a special compressed water and sand cutter to slice through the solid steel.
Well, I think a prison is a better place to be, because there you can, there you have some space to walk around. It's very, very tight, and you live with 4 or 6 guys in a very small chamber. And if usually they try to manage it in such a way that when you're not asleep, that your other team is working, that you have some space to walk around in if you have to eat or shower or whatever you want to do.
The teams were totally interdependent, and given their cramped living conditions, they had to get along well.
We work for 6 hours and straight. Then you're allowed to go back to the bell for a little water or a little lunch or something to eat. But basically, it's as soon as you are out of the bell, it's work. They don't allow you to sit or relax for a few minutes or so. It's always production, production, production.
By early September, all the holes had been cut in the Kursk's hull, and a second group of divers arrived to install the suction anchors and the cutting system to remove the torpedo section. The Arctic summer was drawing to a close. The first few runs went well, but as the vacuum anchors dug into the seabed, the driving cable that connected the hydraulic pulley system to the sawing wire got snagged in a guide sheath and snapped. The anchors had to be taken out, repaired and re-sunk, costing the project precious time. The same problem arose 3 times.
We're losing already a lot of time with the testing in Kirkenes, and at the moment when we start cutting, we have not so much time because the winter season starts. So every delay was critical.
A cable broke 3 times, and then we had to keep everything out of the water, reinstall it on 150 meters depth, and that I think that was a delay of in total 3 weeks, and that was really a problem.
By the time the Smit engineers could say the nose had been cut off, the Russians were worrying that their operation was running too late. With the biggest payment at stake, and with the October gales round the corner, the salvage deal nearly fell apart.
I went to Spassky in the Barents Sea job site to sign the act because we had cut off the nose. And then he said, Frans, I don't sign. And I thought, oh my God. And we were later, of course, in the season. I think now the old fox is trying to make difficulties. He said, no, the nose is not cut off, not completely.
But it is very difficult to convince the Russian that the wire is through the steel. And we do some calculations and we say, yeah, we have cut the Kursk.
I said, but Spassky, I said, my people are really saying that it is cut off. He said, Frans, it's not cut off. And we had hard arguments.
It was cut. It was not cut. What could we do? So we accepted a certain risk.
So, and then he said, Frans, I sign it. I said, you can go to the bank. I signed the act. But I tell you, the nose is not cut off. He was right.
The October storm clouds were gathering, and the Arctic winter threatened to make recovery impossible. The last stage of the salvage began. At the end of September, the Giant 4 sailed from Kirkenes in Norway to the Barents Sea, and finally arrived at its anchoring location right above the sunken Kursk. It took an entire day to position the Giant 4 precisely over the Kursk using ROV underwater cameras. The weather was turning bad just as the barge was being positioned and the engineers on board were preparing the heave compensation mechanism. Workers acted swiftly and efficiently to get things done in the brief windows of good weather.
We had to install the plugs, the grippers. The first 3 took so much time that I think, oh yeah, we will end up in half November.
Worse was to come. The winter storms approached just as the first grippers were being installed.
At one side, it nearly went underwater, and then on the other side, and so it moved back and forth. We were about 8 meters high, so we were 7 meters above the water surface, and so it went so far, and its width is 36 meters.
The heave mechanisms compensated for the 8-meter-high waves, but could not handle anything higher.
And one time I tried to talk to Spassky and said, Spassky, what are we going to do when we are too late, when the season is over and the weather is too bad to do the job? Could not talk about it.
There was still a danger that the cables already attached to the Kursk would snap in the powerful, stormy seas.
We were in the middle of the barge, and obviously we don't have that high heave, so with the bad weather, we loosened everything. So there was no tension left on the cables.
Despite the weather, the team decided to proceed. The point of no return had passed. The job had to be done. Meanwhile, back in the Netherlands, Jan van Suimeren's wife, Ma, had no news from the Arctic Sea. She prayed daily, although deep down she believed Jan would ultimately succeed.
Then he said to me, Mar, I need 2 days of good weather. 2 days. And then he looked up and he said, and I know I'm going to get it. I've done so much in my life, but this job is so important. So much is involved in this. So many people are involved. I'll be given some help. I feel it. And on that film, that documentary, you can see it. The storms had gone. The plugs had been placed, and he wakes up and there is a rainbow in the sky.
That morning, we pulled everything into tension, and we went on.
I'm a Catholic, not anymore, but grown up as a Catholic. And I saw a Russian Orthodox church So I really went for the first time after 30 years. I went into the church and say, "Oh my God, try to help me."
Once the worst winter storm of that October had passed, the grippers could be installed. With the much-needed break in the weather, the pace of work increased, and 6 grippers were installed daily.
And then really the grippers, there was a learning curve, you know. And after the 4th, 5th, and in 2-3 days, the grippers were installed.
The Kursk was lying in the mud and was stuck there. So it was very important for the engineers to calculate the forces that the cables and all the other equipment could withstand, because at first, as the submarine was being detached from the seafloor, there was a suction effect.
Someone suggested we move it a little first, to detach it from the seafloor. I thought we ought to move it more drastically from left to right. That night, I went on the deck of the barge with its 26 grippers installed, thinking about what we could do, and a slight wind began blowing, and I saw bubbles in the sea as the barge began rocking from left to right. I was stunned, and despite everything, I began to believe in God.
The Russians knew that there would be no storms that weekend, so they planned to raise the Kursk on Saturday or Sunday. I remember that the weather was ideal and there was a full moon.
Finally, on the night of the 7th of October, the Kursk was ready to be raised. Tension filled the air as the historic moment drew near.
Stand by. We can starting to lift.
We gave the go-ahead to lifting, but we were very doubtful as to whether it was the right choice. And then, as they were lifting, the nose section fell off. Or maybe it had been detached by the explosion. In any case, it fell off. So we were quite lucky.
The strand jacks creaked and pulled at full speed. 15 hours later, the Soviet-era submarine had been hoisted from the bottom of the sea. The Russian engineers and mariners watched the ROV images with bated breath.
Everyone cheered, "Success, success," and there was an explosion of emotion. Why so much emotion? Because no one was fully convinced that they would pull it out.
Finally, at 7 p.m. on the next day, Pete Sink,
The ship's captain ordered the anchors raised and turned the barge into the wind. The successful 15-hour operation was a bittersweet triumph.
Вы знаете, на следующее утро, когда мы были уже на Майо,
You know, on the Mayo, the next day, there was again an outpouring of emotion,
это был такой всплеск эмоций.
and the president of the Dutch company cried.
Президент голландской компании, у него слезы потекли.
You know, when there is such an accumulation of emotion, all of a sudden there's a rapid collapse in the other direction.
The crew of the Giant celebrated, though it was impossible to ignore the tragedy that had brought them there. However, there was still one last phase of the salvage that would involve another massive feat of engineering, this time made in Russia. The Giant 4 barge with its 24 lifting towers had successfully raised the Kursk submarine from the bottom of the Barents Sea. The enormous barge was now on its way back to Murmansk with its precious cargo, a nuclear-powered Soviet submarine slung underneath. The two semi-submersible pontoons, named after Gon and Ma, the wives of Franz and Jan, crossed the path of the Giant on the 10th of October 2001. The two pontoons were tugged up to the sides of the Giant 4. They acted as massive ballast tanks to be sunk and then slipped under the barge. Once refloated, they would lift the barge and submarine combination out of the water, so it could enter the shallow Russian dry dock. This entirely new phase of the operation proved one of the most complex, as the pontoons had a design flaw. Gon and Ma were found to be unstable, and Russian divers had to add extra ballast to keep them upright as they sank.
Just like the Titanic, the upper bulkheads hadn't been fully welded, so there was an opening. So that was simply a construction error, so there was an overflow, and that's why they sank. We solved the problem by adding something to it, and by doing things differently. But that was the mistake, simply a construction error.
Dat was de fout, dat was gewoon een constructiefout.
The pontoons lifted the Giant and the precious cargo slung under it by 16 meters, so that together they were high enough out of the water to enter the dry dock of Murmansk. On October the 22nd, 2001, the grippers were slowly released, and the Kursk lay on the bottom of the Russian-built dock. The Giant could be tugged away, but not before Captain Pete Sinker and the crew cast a wreath of flowers to salute the fallen submariners still trapped in the Kursk. It was an emotional farewell. Shortly after the Dutch mariners had left, the time came for the Russian Navy to extract the bodies and find out what had happened to the pride of their fleet. A mysterious round hole was present on the part of the hull that the Dutch saw chain had not removed. Officers examined the gaping torpedo room once all the twisted debris had been removed. Many different theories began to take shape. Was it hit by an American sub, also in the area? Was the Kursk struck by a torpedo? Did one of its own torpedoes malfunction and explode? The secret, stealthy submarine was thoroughly examined by Russian Navy investigators. But what sank the Kursk would remain cloaked in controversy and mystery. The victims' families were left with just the memories of their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers. The men were honored with a somber religious ceremony in a mass funeral attended by respectful citizens of the port of Murmansk.
Где сегодня Курск?
What has become of the Kursk?
Сегодня в сердцах и умах людей.
The Kursk is in the hearts and minds of people who believed that the project would be successful.
Что будет? И этих людей было, по
These
крайней мере, в
people
России
who supported the task,
очень много встречал людей, которые тогда действительно не спали ночами.
there were very, very many.
С моряками, с подводниками.
Igor Spassky attended the state funeral of the 118 mariners who perished with the Kursk. Their families watched in stunned silence.
When days, months later, when all those men had to be buried, we were there too at the funeral. Well, that was really moving. That was touching. And one mother even came the whole way down here to hold me and to thank me personally for having been able to actually do the job. She came to Rotterdam, Schiedam.
Вот эта вся операция еще и подсказывает.
All this operation tells us that at times of such tragic events, the whole world should unite to grapple with them.
Всем миром наваливаться на такие события. И то, что у нас было такое.
There was colossal collaboration between our people and the Dutch, and the cooperation of all these companies has allowed our experiences and their experiences to blend in a unique operation that had never been attempted before.
Потому что таких операций в мире не делали.
Вот это кусок.
This is a piece of the inner hull. It's all deformed.
И в нем я чувствую ту колоссальную
And in it I feel a special energy,
энергию, колоссальную
an incredible sense of what happened there.
что произошло. Это здесь.
The infamous Kursk submarine, once the proud prowler of the Arctic Sea, has since been broken up and disposed of. But the Herculean effort to raise the massive wreck would cement a bond of mutual respect between the Dutch and Russian salvage masters who together made nautical history.